So we go to our second part of our discussion now. I think Nikos would like to say something.
Yeah, very briefly actually, and it's not about Greece, Turkey and NATO, but it's actually about Greece and NATO, and I think that's a very important thing, at least from my point of view. NATO also has, in my area, right, in the area of emerging disruptive technologies, a very important capacity building capability. And for example, Greece now is in the process of standing up defense innovation initiatives, using NATO as a kind of an advisor because of NATO's ability to tap into 31 other countries and transferring all this good practice from very advanced countries on both sides of the Atlantic to Greece, I think is also a very important contribution that NATO could make to Greece.
Would you like to say something, Marilena?
No, I prefer that
Get questions.
Yes.
we get the questions.
Invite our audience for questions. Who would like to go first? Please, stand up.
Hi, thank you for inviting us. My name is Oana, and I would like to ask about disinformation. As a member of the communication team, and having in mind the information warfare in Ukraine and South China Sea, I would like to ask about the key aspects of the strategic communication of NATO. Thank you.
No, I think
Okay, I'll start and maybe you can add on the South China Sea. Yeah, I think NATO has been dealing with disinformation from the start, right? 75 years ago, we knew the Soviet Union was involved in so-called active measures, and so that's only been intensified. It's now on an industrial scale. And we can see, obviously, it's not just against NATO, it's against each of our societies, against specific communities, against the European Union. We've seen the announcement yesterday by the Belgian Prime Minister that they're looking into efforts to effectively buy members of the European Parliament who can spread Russian influence and undermine support for Ukraine in the next European Parliament. So these are issues which are now part of this sort of hybrid warfare, but are also used to shape the battlefield, if you wish, in Ukraine. I would say that in terms of NATO, while I was a spokesperson, we saw a transition in terms of our approach to countering disinformation from debunking disinformation, which was our focus mainly from 2014, the illegal annexation of Crimea onwards, to what we call pre-bunking, which was the focus of our approach in the run-up to Russia's full-fledged invasion in 22. So in 2014, NATO was, I think, the first international organization to set up a site which we call Setting the Record Straight on the NATO website. It's still there, getting constantly updated, debunking the main Russian narratives about NATO. Obviously, NATO doesn't have the remit to replace nations in their efforts, but we can support and network and exchange information and situational awareness. And Setting the Record Straight remains a template for national efforts to debunk disinformation. But in 21, at the end of 21, as we saw Russia's intentions, we did something that we had never done before, and which frankly I think nobody else can do like NATO can do, because in NATO we also exchange intelligence, and we have shared intelligence and intelligence picture. So we declassified unprecedented amounts of intelligence that we had coming from all our allies to expose Russia's plans, Russia's intentions, Russia's false flag operations, what it intended to do, to open them up to public scrutiny and also to create this greater awareness among our allies and our public opinions. And we saw in 22, it was clear from the start that it was Russia that was the aggressor and Ukraine was the victim of aggression. And that was very important for us to forge unity among our public opinions and an understanding of what the stakes were. And I think it helped that unprecedented unity that we saw in 22 in support for Ukraine, and which obviously needs to continue, and that's the effort that needs to continue right now.
Marilena and then Nikos would like to add something?
Yes, I wanted to say that at the level of cybersecurity, disinformation and propaganda, the cooperation between EU and NATO is one really of the very privileged areas. And especially in the last joint declaration of March 2023, there are many, many elements exactly on that. Having said that, I have to underline that, unfortunately, and following to what Thanos has said, cooperation between the two organizations is limited to staff cooperation and not at all at operational level. And we have to note that there is only one operation on the field, Operation Althea in Bosnia-Herzegovina, since 2004, which is the only Berlin Plus operation, meaning an operation using NATO, EU operation using NATO capabilities. So we have difficulties there, and I think this is something the two organizations have to work on.
But in terms of disinformation, I think the meetings between NATO and the EU at all levels are actually extremely frequent. They're very operational.
Not fruitful, however. I mean, not very, very concrete
actually,
results.
In my experience, they were quite fruitful, and there were lots of exchanges about opinion polls, what we're each doing in terms of dealing with specific threats, working on projects on specific countries. It doesn't always need to be highly publicized as long as it works, as long as we get the job done, frankly. And the same thing with the G7. We had very good cooperation in the run-up to the Vilnius summit, regular exchanges, again, very operational with the people who are actually doing the communication. So rest assured, it's happening.
Not so sure, but anyway.
But maybe to add up to what Oana said, two very practical examples of what we're doing today about disinformation. Not disinformation targeted to NATO, because Oana already covered that, but actually how NATO also tries to serve as a platform to help allies with disinformation. So the first one is we have established an expert task force at NATO looking at AI-enabled disinformation and information operations. We're talking with industry, specialized companies that are actually able to detect disinformation campaigns online. And we're also talking to experts from different countries, trying to put together a toolbox that will then be available for the countries. This is the first thing. And the second, as Oana already alluded, there is very close cooperation between both NATO EU and NATO G7 on disinformation. And actually, there's another working group there that NATO is actually chairing on disinformation under the G7 umbrella, and that would also deliver results in the coming months.
And it's also an issue with our Indo-Pacific partners, because you're talking about the South China Sea. That's really, we've had colleagues from Australia, from New Zealand, from Japan, Singapore, and others at NATO, again, exchanging information, because the reality is that our Indo-Pacific partners know and are telling us, the Japanese Prime Minister, for others, what is happening in Europe today with Ukraine could happen in Asia tomorrow. So there is a very clear understanding that if Russia wins in Ukraine, it will not stop in Ukraine, but also that it will send a very clear message. It will embolden other autocratic regimes like China and perhaps others to use force to achieve their means.
A second question? Yes, please, Ambassador Diamesis, and then the gentleman. Yeah.
I used to serve, as Oana said, as a Greek perm rep to NATO. And I must say that it's not a question, it's just to tell to the rest of the audience that NATO has an amazing way of fighting its irrelevance. The first time I was at NATO in the 90s, everybody thought that NATO is irrelevant and it's in extinction, etc., etc. So I think Thanos said that there is always a reason when you do the two metaphors. One of the two is that when we will need it, it will be there. So that was the one thing. And the second is, I don't want to disagree with dear Oana, but the truth is that we could do a lot more between NATO and EU. The problem is not, of course, of NATO, neither of the EU. There are political problems that hinder this capability. The other truth, allow me to say, is that there is an excellent cooperation, and I will end up with something that my Dutch colleague told me when I was leaving NATO, that Michael, you are a wonderful colleague, but you were quite difficult. The reason being that, of course, the political problems that we had with the closer cooperation between the two organizations. Let's hope that in the near future, with what started the last months, sometime in the future, maybe not so near, we will find our way to have a closer cooperation, which is really needed. Thank you so much.
Let's take the second question, the gentleman.
Good morning. I'm Ian Brzezinski from the Atlantic Council. And without question, NATO has been history's most successful and effective military alliance. And that's not just because it developed effective institutions and deployed highly effective multinational forces. It was successful because it demonstrated consistently it had the political will, the resoluteness, the political grit, the readiness to go to battle when challenged. That's why it prevailed in the Cold War. Is that the case today? And I ask that because NATO leaders have consistently said that the Russian invasion against Ukraine is existential. It's going to lead to, if Putin succeeds, we will have a wider war in Europe. Yet here we are, 2 years into this war, and Ukraine is slipping. And I ask this because the alliance has $55 trillion in GDP to Russia's 1.8, 25 times the time. NATO spends 10 times the amount of money on defense as does Russia, 1.2 trillion to roughly 88 to 100 million dollars. NATO forces are exponentially better equipped, better trained, higher morale than the Russian counterparts. How is it that NATO is not crushing Russia's invasion of Ukraine? What does this say about NATO's resoluteness? Can we have a summit that will celebrate NATO's 75th anniversary in Washington this summer? A summit that inspires confidence about the credibility of NATO's deterrent capacity. If that summit occurs in the context of Ukraine at continued stalemate or perhaps losing territory to Russia.
Is there any other question, or we can, yes, please.
Alexandre.
Yeah.
Sorry, I think that's a nice trifecta. Alexandre Escorcia, so I used to be a deputy permanent person at NATO headquarters. Good to see you again. I would like to pick up exactly on those 2 points and actually link them up. So Washington with Europeans showing that they can share their share of the burden. How can we do that? And I'm a little struck, to be honest, that there is a lot of institutional discussion about NATO, but precious little concrete things, and I would like to get a little bit more into that and maybe ask you about what you think, how you think that could look like in Washington, because I think it would be a powerful message, including to US audiences in the context of the campaign in the US.
Who will go first?
I can maybe
You can start and I can
Yeah,
follow.
exactly, yeah. I think to Ian's question, of course, NATO is a defensive alliance. Its aim is not to crush Russia. That's not its existential aim. It's to defend allies. And the reality of NATO is, of course, it will defend its allies. And that's where there is a difference between allies and partners like Ukraine. For allies, we have Article 5. And the collective defense obligation. So, of course, NATO's role has been from the start as defined and agreed by allies by consensus, on the one hand, to support Ukraine and Ukraine's self-defense against Russia's aggression, but second, also to make sure that there was no escalation of the conflict into NATO allies. But of course, I agree with you that allies, all allies, have been too slow and perhaps too deliberate, because we wanted to avoid escalation in providing Ukraine with everything it needs at the moment it needs it for its self-defense, which is why you'll have seen NATO Secretary General Jens Stoltenberg urging allies from the start to do more, to do it faster. And we have seen unprecedented support, but right now, of course, with a significant delay in the US Congress, there are also significant risks to the future course of the conflict, which is why at the meeting of foreign ministers last week, Jens Stoltenberg proposed this mission for Ukraine, which is about training, it's about equipping, it's also about funding for the future, so that by folding this into the institutional framework of NATO rather than through multilateral or bilateral arrangements, you would also in a way insulate it from political uncertainties wherever, not just in the United States, because of course we have elections in all our countries. So I think that will be, to come to Alexander's point, I think that would be an important outcome by the Washington summit in July, to make sure that we have a predictable, sustainable framework for financing, equipping and training Ukrainian forces so that they win. Because I think we have to be very clear that it's about not just surviving, it's about winning this. And the other elements, I think burden sharing, we've seen European allies doing significantly more in terms of defense spending and capabilities, especially in the last 10 years, since 2014. Is it enough? Again, I would say it's not enough. We do need, France is now on 2%, congratulations, Germany as well. This is an important signal from big European allies, also obviously together with Greece and our Baltic and Polish allies, Romania. But we need to go beyond 2%. And I think clearly we need to go to 3% and 4% in GDP, not just to please whoever sits in the White House, whether it's Joe Biden or Donald Trump, but to make sure that we can keep our people safe in this more dangerous world.
Thanos?
Well, the question is really about the cohesion of the West, and I think looking back, we did better than expected. If I was asked that question in February 2022, what are my expectations? I think we did rather well. But having said that, and I like your numbers, but one has to remember that this should be divided by 32 decision-making centers, defense budgets, so it's not as simple as that. But then we should also keep in mind that, well, cohesion is something that should not be taken for granted, and that we have, not all member states have applied sanctions or have transferred weapons to Ukraine. And not all of our friends outside of the West have decided to accept our version of what happened in Ukraine, and then they made decisions on the basis of their own interests, perhaps not surprising, but that created huge loopholes in the sanctions regime. And then at the end of the day, numbers do matter, and I'm talking about manpower, which is perhaps now the greatest problem for Ukraine. But having said that, of course, we should continue the effort, because if Ukraine loses, then we all lose one way or the other.
Thank you. Colleagues, do you have any final comment? Because our time
I think
is
there was
running
one
out.
more question.
Is there an additional question?
One more question
Yes,
there.
Yeah, there
then
was
we
one
can
more.
take a question.
Hello, I hope I'm young enough to ask a question. Another Ian, Ian Begg from the London School of Economics. I want to take issue with something Marilena said, where you said there is this great idea of using 0.5% of EU GDP as a further budget to support activity. One of the members of the EU who's not in NATO is Austria. You have no chance, absolutely no chance of getting unanimity on a further EU budget. And I think it's a fantasy to think that could happen. And one last remark is, we say Russia invaded Ukraine. Russia says they're fighting NATO. Is that not a problem?
May I? May I start? You ask whether 0.5 is realistic. If you ask me personally, no. But it's a great change that it's put on the table now. It's the first time we seriously discuss that a part of the EU budget goes to defense. This is revolutionary, because up to now, any action, operation that had a military or security background was out of the community budget. So this is a big change. And a lot of things, as the European Defence Fund, which is always also a fund from the EU budget, has been already operating since, if I'm correct, 2019. So defense is in the EU now. This is revolutionary, this is new, and of course it needs time. We don't expect this proposal to be agreed before the European elections or even during this year. But you know, the EU, in my view, is a process. When something starts, it will eventually lead to an agreement at a certain point. We'll see.
Thank you, Marilena. You mentioned elections.
I don't know if Thanos wants to talk
you
about
would like
it.
to add something?
Just to say that I'm one of those strange people that are at the same time strongly pro-NATO and strongly pro-European strategic autonomy, because I think these are not mutually exclusive. Strengthening European military capabilities automatically will strengthen NATO as well, provided, of course, we avoid the trap of duplication.
Yeah.
Yeah, okay, this is very tempting now. Yeah, I think we need to sort of ask ourselves what strategic autonomy actually means, and you may have heard Jens Stoltenberg ask that question, for him and for me as well, it means, okay, so we want to do the big things, strategic, alone, autonomy. So the question is, if we're worried about, Donald Trump or others saying America alone, why are we not worried about people saying Europe alone? Because I think we really need to ask ourselves, can we afford to go it alone in a world where we see autocracies going together? So I will just leave it to that. I think what unites us remains stronger than what divides us. And of course, that's also an argument that we need to make to our American friends.
Yes, before elections.
The reality is that if you look at the polls, if you look at bipartisan support in Congress for NATO, that remains extremely high, including in the latest poll. So I think in the end, it is in our self-interest to continue to work together as Europe and North America in NATO, while of course continuing to strengthen European capabilities, to invest more, because in the end, it will be about money and capabilities.
But not only.
Right now, 20%, the European EU members' contribution in terms of defense spending is still 20% of the NATO defense spending. So, there are various elements there. But I would just answer Ian's question very briefly. Yes, of course, Russia will always cast NATO as the enemy. But if you look at what's happening on the ground, you've seen Russia actually withdrawing most of the troops that it had on the border with Finland. which has, of course, now joined NATO. And just to sum up Putin's strategic failure, is that if he said he wanted less NATO on its borders, he now has much more NATO on its borders. Russia's border with NATO has actually doubled with the accession of Finland. The whole Baltic Sea is basically part of NATO with the exception of the Kaliningrad exclave, now that Sweden has also joined. So that is a massive geopolitical shift through the accession to the North Atlantic Alliance of Finland and Sweden, and it shows the bankruptcy, the strategic bankruptcy of Putin's strategy in Ukraine. We must continue to stay united that Ukraine finally prevails.
Thank you all. We are approaching the end of our session. Thank you very much for your contribution. And I would like also to thank the Delphi Forum for including a special session on NATO's 75th anniversary. And I do hope that this cooperation between the Delphi and NATO will continue. Everybody's happy, I believe, with this cooperation, especially the colleagues being here from Brussels. So, and thank you all for your presence. And on this note, I would like to invite Admiral Diakopoulos to deliver the concluding remarks.
Thank you very much.